if we can get channel 8 up and running. And
they're ready to go.
All right, perfect. Let's make sure everybody's here. I know Rachel's checking in, so she'll be here momentarily. All right, well, we'll just get started, and through the announcements, we'll get Rachel in. So good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's study session. I'll wait for that recording. This is tonight's study session of the Boulder City Council. I'm Councilmember Matt Benjamin, and thank you all for joining us. I will make note that Councilmember Yates will not be joining us because he is out of country, and so we miss him and hope we'll get to see him again in 2 weeks when we reconvene on October 6th. On tonight's agenda, we have really just 2 items to go through. Our first item will be to cover the sort of preliminary scoping of the Transit Area Village Plan, otherwise known as TVAP 2 or Boulder Junction 2. So maybe we'll have a straw poll, one of many, to decide what the actual term we'll use is. So I'm just kidding. Maybe that won't be the case, but we'll try to keep it simple and organized in terms of the naming. And then an update on the projects for comprehensive planning. And then we'll sort of have some updates on budget reallocation for the library funding. If in fact, there is a library district that gets created, and the consequences of that ballot measure, will go through some of those issues as well. And then we'll go ahead and just start this meeting with tonight's announcements. And I do want to maybe pause after I did some of those. Actually, after announcements, I want to turn over to Mayor Brockett just for a hot second. But with some of our announcements, we have COVID-19 testing and vaccinations. For testing, for information and provider locations, and for free COVID-19 testing, go to www.boco.org/COVID testing. In spite of what President Biden said, the pandemic is not over. We are still dealing with it here in town, and people are still getting it. So let's be careful, be cautious, be safe. And also do check vaccinations. The bivalent booster is now available. So if people are interested in that specific Omicron-based booster, do check local pharmacies for information about that, or do talk to your doctor. But there are some restrictions with regards to that vaccine pertaining to when you've probably had other boosters. So there is a new one out, and people are getting them. And so for vaccine information, do go to www.boco.org/COVID vaccine. Next slide. And much anticipated return to council chambers. We've had certainly a false start in May, and it looks like we are doing well now with regards to council and staff being in person. And what that means is now that we've got our legs under us, public participation in chambers will resume at the October 6th regular council meeting. Council and staff are working to ensure we have had all the pieces put in place to hold hybrid meetings before inviting the public back to chambers. Even those of us at the dais, right, and those at home have recognized there's been volume and other tech issues. So it's glad that we've worked some of those kinks out, and we're ready to welcome the public back in. And with the public being invited back for the October 6th meeting, which is in 2 weeks, as a reminder, next week, we do not have a meeting. We want to remind everyone that you will be that you will be offering the public to participate in both a variety virtual and in person. So it will be hybrid in that sense. And you will be asked to indicate in the open comment and public hearings forms if you will be speaking virtually or in person. In-person speakers will speak first, and virtual speakers will follow. All speakers will be listed in order in which they signed up. All speakers will have the option to change their location preference if needed by contacting the city clerk's office at cityclerksoffice@bouldercolorado.gov prior to the start of the meeting. I think that concludes our announcements. Mayor Brockett, I was going to give you the mic for a minute.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I just want to let folks know I'm not feeling great tonight, so I will have my camera off for most of the meeting. Apologies in advance for that, but I will still chime in as occasion requires it. Thanks.
Thanks, Aaron. Now that we've done announcements, we can kind of get right into all the good stuff. But before we get into our work items, I just want to sort of outline, how this meeting will be conducted. We're going to review the staff presentations and sort of go through the items that are of the subject. And we will have time for questions. Ideally, we'll save questions for the very end unless staff has a break slide within their presentation where they are asking questions. So we'll take lead on staff in terms of where they want input. And so let's try to hold back questions on a slide-by-slide basis and either wait for those breaks or wait till the presentation is over. And then we will sort of have a chance to ask questions and certainly have that council discussion that'll hopefully give guidance to staff on the questions they have asked. And now with that out of the way, I'm going to turn it over to our city manager and Nuria Rivera Vandermeide and to introduce the first item. Nuria, take it away.
Thanks so much, Matt. And I'm still marveled that all of you can say my entire name, which has not happened in my previous city. So yay for Boulder. I'm not going to take up a whole lot of time. The first item we have today is actually on a project that well preceded my coming here and has been a while in the making. And so I will ask Brad Mueller to introduce himself and take the helm.
Thank you, Nuria. I am Brad Mueller, the Director of Planning and Development Services. Good evening, councilors. We are very excited to bring forward this overview of Boulder Junction 2 and recognize it as one of council's priorities, certainly recognizing and building on the success of what is now a built out, mostly built out Boulder Junction 1 and looking forward to the next enhancements in the city. We'll also talk a little bit about council, other work program items within planning and development services. So we essentially have this presentation divided into two parts. We'll have an opportunity to stop for discussion after the first part. I would like to introduce Christopher Johnson right now, the Senior Manager for Comprehensive Planning, who will start the presentation, and then we'll have a little bit of handoff as we go along. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Brad. Good evening, council members. We'll wait for the presentation to come up and we'll get started. Perfect. Great. Well, as Brad mentioned, my name is Christopher Johnson. I'm the Comprehensive Planning Senior Manager within Planning and Development Services. I am very excited to be here this evening. It is my first study session with City Council, so that's exciting. And also we're talking about a really exciting project as well. And I'm excited to work with all of you to accomplish your identified priorities that were established at the retreat earlier this year and really ultimately implement the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan through all the work that we do within our Comprehensive Planning Division. I have asked a number of several other comprehensive planning team members to join me this evening, just in case there are questions about specific projects that you may have later on in the presentation or during the discussion session. Sarah Corse is a new principal planner on the team, and she'll be the lead project manager for what we're calling Boulder Junction Phase 2. She'll cover a couple of slides here a little bit later in the presentation. Kathleen King is here as well. She's another principal planner that many of you know and is the lead on the East Boulder Sub-Community Plan, which thankfully will be back in front of you at that first hybrid in-person meeting on October 6th. And then Chris Ranglos is a senior planner in our division. He oversees a lot of the department master planning, coordination, and our annual capital improvements plan work that we do. I also wanted to introduce quickly Vivian Castro-Wooldridge, who is part of Brenda Rittenauer's team on the communications and engagement side, but she is the new engagement senior project manager for planning, which is a mouthful, but importantly, she is focused on PNDS and will ultimately help create and execute all of our public engagement strategies. So we're really excited that Vivian has joined the team just a couple of weeks ago and is getting up to speed very quickly. And also Brad is here, of course, and he'll be on hand to help facilitate the conversation regarding some of our future work planning and priorities, which is the second portion of this presentation. Next slide, please. So as we mentioned this evening, we're going to cover two primary topics. First, we're going to present some background on the Transit Village Area Plan and then describe what we are putting forward as two preliminary options for a scope of work to implement Phase 2 of this plan. We'll take a break at that point. We'll pause to ask the key questions of you and listen to your feedback, hopefully to really help us refine the trajectory of the project and ultimately what our community engagement approach looks like based on the scope of work. Second, then we'll move into an update on many other planning priorities that we're balancing across the department. And really, this is intended to serve as an introduction to a more in-depth conversation that we plan to have with all of you about our priorities and staffing scheduled for a future study session, which is currently on the calendar for November 10th. So hopefully tonight is really just an opportunity to tee up the conversation, and then we can come back on November 10th with some more details. Next slide. So we're going to begin this evening with what we're calling Boulder Junction Phase 2. And the reason I'm saying that is that I think many of us as city staff members and members of council, we've become pretty used to using the shorthand of TVAP for Transit Village Area Plan to describe this neighborhood or this project. We believe that Boulder Junction is probably a more familiar term for the general public, and we want to try to move away from the plannerese that we often find ourselves falling into. So we're going to endeavor to use TVAP or Transit Village Area Plan when we are referring specifically to the plan itself, but then using the terminology of Boulder Junction in reference to this location and the neighborhood itself. Next slide. So before I move on, I'm just going to really quickly run through the 3 questions that we included in the staff memo to all of you and that we have for you tonight to help us guide the future of the project. The first is related to the proposed land uses that are in the plan currently and whether or not those should be updated. Next slide. The second is relevant to the transportation connections plan and whether or not some amendments or updates should also be considered as part of the scope of work. And then the third item, next slide, is really just a general question in terms of additional feedback that you may have on the proposed scope and the schedule for phase 2 of this project. So hope you can just keep those questions in mind as we move through the presentation, and certainly bring that forward as part of your feedback during the discussion portion. Next slide. So phase 2 of the Transit Village Area Plan was identified at the retreat as one of the top priorities by City Council earlier this year. We have been able to add some important staff capacity, and we're definitely rebuilding our comprehensive planning team and also looking forward to future positions through the 23 budget. So we are very much now poised to begin work on this project and excited to do so. Next slide. So in terms of just a review of the area plan itself, it was adopted back in 2007, really established a vision to guide development within this area of Boulder Junction. As you would expect, within the plan itself, there's detailed recommendations on future land uses, various character districts, transportation connections, a lot of information around transportation demand management. One of the key aspects of this was to not increase significantly the amount of single occupancy vehicle trips. And so there was also an implementation plan that was created after the adoption of the original plan that really outlines more specifically what needs to be implemented, particularly in terms of infrastructure, and who would be responsible for that, how it moves forward, and when. Next slide. So just to orient everybody and give everyone a quick frame of reference, I'm sure you're all very familiar with this particular area, but generally the plan boundary falls along Valmont Road on the north, Foothills Parkway on the east, the railroad and the North Boulder Farmers Ditch at the south end, and then 30th Street on the west. You can see that there's a small portion that's west of 30th Street. And again, just to orient yourself, that's actually the location of the new fire station number 3 that's been discussed recently. Next slide. So within the plan itself, it identifies 2 main phases for the implementation of various land use changes, the infrastructure improvements, and ultimately the redevelopment activity in this area. The first phase, which you can see on the left, is generally located west of the railroad tracks, and phase 2 is generally east of the railroad. You'll notice that phase 2 also included what ultimately became known more recently as phase 2A, which is the portion that is west of 30th Street, and the implementation of the land use changes to bring that into and up to date within the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan land use map. That all occurred during this most recent update, which occurred back in early 2021. So really the focus of what we consider to be phase 2 really is therefore on that larger portion that is east of the railroad there, shown in the dashed blue boundary on the right-hand side. Next slide. The original redevelopment horizon for phase one was about 10 to 15 years. We're now at the end of that, just in terms of time, but also in terms of the actual amount of redevelopment that has occurred in that phase one area. And within the implementation plan, there's further direction on when it would be deemed appropriate to move forward with phase two. And there were three primary sort of triggers for that. The first was demonstrating substantial completion of phase one, something that we're working on currently within our staff and other departments. The second is to confirm that there's market demand for the land uses that are proposed within phase two. Ultimately, we'll be working with a consultant to do a market study to confirm that. And then third, there is a need to develop a plan for providing the infrastructure improvements within the phase two area. So that, again, is going to be something worked on within various departments to strategize and scope that out. Next slide. We're going to touch on each of those three really quickly with a couple of slides. So the first one, if you recall, was substantial completion of phase one. As I mentioned, we are actually already in the process of completing something we're going to be terming the substantial completion report, which will provide more information about the redevelopment that's occurred and how it is achieving the goals of the plan. There are a few major takeaways that I do want to call out quickly. In terms of the overall sort of planning and regulatory outcomes, there were several updates that have occurred and occurred quite a long time ago, actually, in terms of changes to the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan land use map. There was a creation of a form-based code that applied to this particular area and a number of other code changes that ensure redevelopment does not outpace the infrastructure needs and also contributes to those multimodal and TDM goals. In addition, there are two general improvement districts that were set up and established to provide governance for this area, and those were established to help pay for and ultimately manage some of the parking improvements and also the TDM programs that apply in this particular area. Next slide. So within that overall governance and regulatory framework, of course, there are several physical built outcomes that have occurred over the last 10 to 15 years. And through the redevelopment of this area, there's been approximately 1,500 total residential units that have been constructed. Over 300 of those as permanently affordable, so in excess of close to 25%. New hotel, restaurants, shops, office space, the preservation of the historic depot building and relocation of that onto this site, a number of improved bike lanes and pedestrian zones and public spaces, and then of course the RTD regional transit hub and the parking structure that's associated with that as well. Next slide. The next question is to think about the demand for the proposed land uses within phase two. So I want to take some time to just examine these a bit closer, and certainly we can get into some questions around these land uses as part of the discussion section. So one thing I want to note quickly is that the description or the naming of these land use categories is unfortunately not aligned with the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan land use categories. So really part of the project as we move forward will be to translate and understand what the expectation was within the plan itself and how these current land uses here that are proposed can be translated into that appropriate category within the BVCP. There are 5 different land use categories in the phase 2 area that you see highlighted in bold in the legend. Primarily, we're talking about high density residential 2, industrial mixed use, office industrial, and then there is a portion of greenway and open space along Goose Creek there towards the center of the phase. Next slide. So the high density residential 2 land use is, you can see there, is on the north side of Goose Creek. It is proposed to allow for stacked flats and lofts, potentially up to 2 to 5 stories in height, approximately 25 to 50 dwelling units per acre, and primarily would be containing underground or structured parking. So not a lot of surface parking in this particular situation. You can see, in the photographs from the plan, sort of the character of what that might look like, but relatively higher density in terms of residential uses. Next slide. And just to give you a bit of understanding of what's there today, the area is currently characterized by a comprehensive plan land use designation of light industrial. It has industrial general zoning that applies to it. And you can see that really it exhibits generally 1 to 2 story office buildings, some light industrial type buildings, et cetera. So implementing the recommendations within the area plan as currently written would be a pretty significant change from what is there today, and certainly would introduce the potential for many more residential uses. Next slide. The industrial mixed use 1 area is directly south of Goose Creek and really located around the old Pearl Street alignment, and as proposed would allow light and service industrial, some small technical offices with potentially live work units, or some residential mixed in vertically or horizontally within buildings. Overall, it anticipates, generally sort of lower scale 1 to 3 story buildings, a floor area ratio of about 0.8 to 1.3. And here it could be structured or potentially surface parking in this condition. Next slide. So the implementation of the proposed land use here, in terms of that industrial mixed use 1, would allow structures that are relatively similar to what is there today. There certainly could be some additional height and density introduced into this particular area. It would also allow for much greater flexibility for residential uses than the current land use and zoning that applies to this particular area. But overall, the sort of built character wouldn't be modified too dramatically. Next slide. The industrial mixed use 2 zone district is a little bit different, and this area is located near Pearl Parkway and Foothills Parkway there to the southern end in the railroad. This allows for a much greater intensity than the industrial mixed use 1 area that we just talked about. So it envisions a strong mix of residential and office and industrial in up to 3 to 4 story buildings, a much higher FAR of 1.5 to 2.0, and primarily structured parking. Next slide. So currently, this area, if you're familiar with it, is primarily kind of some large format light industrial and warehouse type structures. There's a few 1 to 2 story office buildings in those portions that are north of Goose Creek and some other similar uses. So the proposed land use that's in the Transit Village area plan would certainly allow for much greater intensity of uses and building height, and again, allow for much greater flexibility for residential than what exists today under the current land use and zoning, which is fairly restrictive. Next slide. And then finally, I want to touch on the office industrial land use. So this is essentially the northern third of this entire phase 2 area, a pretty large area up the north. It really encourages an intensification of the existing office or industrial areas. It could include the addition of 2 to 3 story industrial or office buildings, relatively low FAR of 0.7 to 1.0, and really continue a mix of structured and surface parking, which is very similar to what's there today. Next slide. So you can see in the images on the right, pretty traditional office park layout with some large surface parking areas, generally 1 to 2 story office buildings. And these are in various states of age and condition. Some have been built or renovated relatively recently, others have not. The proposed land use here within the Transit Village area plan essentially maintains the status quo, aside from perhaps some intensification of those uses, but it does not anticipate the incorporation of residential into this large portion on the north end of phase 2. I want to note here too that certainly given the recent experience that our team has had within the East Boulder sub-community planning effort, and really the desire to create more mixed use type of industrial areas, this is certainly an area that staff is curious about, and whether this particular land use recommendation may warrant some further evaluation and discussion as part of this phase 2 project. Next slide. So finally, coordinated with the proposed land uses, the area plan includes a detailed connections plan that identifies a number of different improvements within the phase 2 area. The city would be responsible for some of these improvements, but it's definitely expected that private redevelopment will contribute to and implement many of these as part of individual projects. A few real key points to just highlight here include extensions of Wilderness Place and Frontier Avenue, and along with a new bridge that would connect and create a primary connection across Goose Creek, sort of near that old Pearl Street area. Next slide. A number of additional local connections to really lead to a much finer and more connected street grid internally to some of these areas. Next slide. And then the addition of multi-use paths and a number of pedestrian connections. A lot of these are adjacent to Foothills Parkway or along Goose Creek, and also in the proximity of a potential future rail station. So I've identified the location of that rail station there with the blue dashed circle, sort of in the northern portion and western side of phase 2. That's another area, I think, in terms of what the future holds potentially for that rail station and how those connections are working is another area that staff is interested in digging into a bit further. So with that, I'm actually going to pass the presentation off to Sarah Corse at this point, who will discuss some of the considerations that we've been weighing as a team that led ultimately to these 2 preliminary options for scope of work for phase 2.
Awesome, thank you, Christopher. And we can go to the next slide. Okay, so Christopher just gave a brief overview of some of the topic areas as well as recommendations from the plan, and that will guide us as we continue into our work for phase 2. So when we began to develop the scope of work as well as engagement strategy for phase 2, there were several different considerations that we felt that we should accommodate into our thinking. So the first set of considerations were about policy related considerations. So such as the relevance of the plan recommendations 15 years later and the alignment of proposed land uses to the community's current needs. We also considered how the potential for reduced transit services in the future might affect proposed land uses and connections. And then we also know that back in 2007, when the plan was completed, there were very few residents in the area, and the city didn't necessarily have a deliberate racial equity focus as well. So in addition to that, the second set of considerations were more about administrative elements, such as tailoring community engagement to the scope of projects, and looking at how we can balance staff resources, considering there are many other city council and department priorities. All right, so with these considerations in mind, we developed 2 preliminary scope options, which I'll present next. But first, I'd like to say that at this time, we feel we need input from you on these options to help guide those the most appropriate direction for the scope of work. And that we wanted to receive initial input from council first, as this is identified as a city council priority project, and your feedback will have a significant influence on the overall trajectory of the project. Then we'll consult planning board and the transportation advisory board once we refine our approach based on your comments. So let's talk about the scope options. You can go to the next slide. So the first option, option A, pretty much looks at what the scope and schedule would be like if we implemented the Transit Village Area Plan as it's currently written, with maybe only a few minor updates. We anticipate the process to include these steps: to do an inventory of existing conditions, to create a strategy for implementing land use and zoning updates, infrastructure phasing and financing, as well as district governance. And then finally, to initiate the adoption of Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan land use changes and form-based code updates. The process would take approximately 15 to 18 months, with work starting around the end of this year and having an anticipated completion date of Q1 of 2024. It would require the equivalent of 1.5 full-time PNDS staff members. And I'd like to note that this is existing staff, and we're not necessarily asking for additional staff. And we also know that other departments would contribute staff throughout the duration of the project as well. In terms of community engagement for this option, it would be more at the inform and consult end of the engagement spectrum. And this is because the assumption is that major policy decisions have already been made and are currently documented in the plan. And then also, as part of engagement, we would utilize the racial equity instruments, and we'd also consult boards and commissions. So as a quick summary of option A, this option would focus primarily on plan implementation rather than new recommendations. You can go to the next slide. All right, so in contrast, the second option, option B, considers what the scope and schedule would be if the 2007 land use and transportation recommendations are reevaluated. And if they are reevaluated, it would then also require adoption of a plan amendment. Option B would then introduce additional tasks 2A, 3A, and 4A, which are in the blue text. And these tasks would include investigating new land use and mobility alternatives, reaching preferred land use and mobility connection recommendations, and then bringing a plan amendment through the adoption process with Planning Board and City Council. So the schedule will then need to extend by approximately 6 to 9 months to accommodate these additional tasks. And that would put the total timeline at about 22 to 24 months, again, with work starting at the end of this year, but with an anticipated completion end date of Q3 of 2024. Additional staff would also need to be assigned to the project to support the expanded scope, which means this option might require the equivalent of about 2.5 full-time PNDS staff members. And public engagement was also expand, and it would expand to consult and involve the community in potential policy changes that we consider. Again, similar to option A, we would utilize the racial equity instrument, and we also consult boards and commissions. In summary, we recognize that this approach places more demands on staff and also lengthens the total time needed to complete the project. However, this option could result in updated policy recommendations that are better aligned with the community's goals and needs now, as well as into the future. Currently, staff is leaning towards option B, and this is partly because the original assumptions around transit, as well as the community needs, have evolved since 2007. There are substantially more residents in the area, such as the new residents that live in the phase 1 area. And we also have the new racial equity instruments, as well as other community engagement tools to reach and respond to groups who may not have participated or been involved in the previous planning process. Next slide. All right, so that was a summary of the scope and schedule for both options A and B. Now, we look forward to hearing your feedback on both of these approaches. We also realize we might have missed something, or there might be a third option somewhere out there, but we can come up with that together today. After the discussion, we plan to refine the scope of work as well as the outreach strategy based on your comments over the next couple months. And I'd like to say, as part of refining the scope, we'll be sure to also identify other departments that we'll need to coordinate and work with as well. And then after that, next, we'll provide Planning Board, the Transportation Advisory Board, as well as you with an update of a more detailed scope of work, probably towards the end of this year or potentially early 2023. And then finally, our hope is to formally launch the project in Q1 of 2023. So thank you, and I'll pass it back to Christopher to continue the presentation.
Great, thank you, Sarah. You can just jump to the next slide, and this is our break here for discussion. So really, as we mentioned at the start of the presentation, really our key questions for you are whether we should explore updates to the current proposed land uses and transportation connections as would be accommodated by option B that was just described earlier. And certainly if council has any additional overall feedback on the scope and the schedules presented this evening, we welcome all of that and look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you, Brad. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Christopher, for the presentation. I'll sort of open up for council questions and some feedback. I will just make a quick observation to simplify. If we can put those questions back up, we might perhaps consider just combining question 1 and 2 to option A, option B, thinking even in the presentation, they seem to combine scope of work about proposed land uses and transportation together. So maybe just for throwing it out there, we might want to just combine question 1 or 2 as an A or B solution rather than parsing them out between land use and transportation. But when we get to answering those questions, just might be a little easier and simplify it that way. So I see a hand up. Nicole, go for it.
Thank you, and thanks, staff. This was a wonderful presentation. You laid everything out really clearly, and just appreciate it. My first question, it's really just purely a question. I was wondering if someone could remind us of what those different levels of engagement are. I know there's a wheel and it has different words on it, sort of showing what is involved at the different engagement stages. Can you just remind us and help us understand what the difference is between option A and option B?
Yes. I can, if you give me 2 moments to find the spectrum. Okay, so the Boulder's engagement spectrum generally has 4 categories, beginning with inform, consult, involve, and collaborate. So our thinking is that under option A, really a lot of those major policy decisions have been made. They're documented in the plan. We really are ultimately just focused on implementing those current proposed recommendations. So we would inform and consult members of the public, and certainly local stakeholders, property owners, folks of that nature. If we moved into option 2, that of course broadens the level of engagement. We would shift slightly towards the consult and involve end of the spectrum because we believe there would need to be some additional conversation, particularly as Sarah mentioned, there's a number of people that actually live in this area now and would want to gather their feedback and input into any updates or amendments to those proposed either land use or connections recommendations.
Thank you. And Matt, would you prefer us just to ask clarifying questions at the moment, or do you want me just to give my input now as well?
Well, let's see. I mean, if we have a slew of questions or clarifying, let's maybe go through that and then we can answer the questions in one fell swoop. But if there aren't too many bites at the apple, then I would turn it right back to you, Nicole. Aaron, go for it.
Yeah, thanks for the informative presentation. Appreciate that from all of you. And so my question is sort of in terms of whether there might be slightly different option on the table. So I get that. So we need to look at this area comprehensively from an infrastructure and standpoint, like about what are the roads and paths and the utility infrastructure and flood mitigation, et cetera, that are necessary to serve this whole area. But it does feel to me like it has some distinct sections to it, like that area north of Goose Creek, which is developed with more recent buildings, I'd say, with more life left in them. Whereas like south of Goose Creek, it tends to be older, smaller buildings that might be more ripe for redevelopment. And then south of Pearl Parkway has a different character from north of Pearl Parkway, kind of as it seems to me. So what I was wondering is that in the first phase of Boulder Junction, there were different sectors in there, and each of them had really finely grained character sketches and studies and different zoning, different land uses, et cetera. Would it be possible to kind of do the overall look at this whole area, but then like have a phased approach on either 1, maybe 2 or 3 different phases? And what I think about is maybe working from the south to the north, because the northern section to me seems like it's less ripe for change. I think it's still worthy of being looked at, but the areas that I think are more riper to the south. So is there any possibility for breaking it up a little bit? And part of my motivation there would be to see if there's something that we could get 100% complete in a shorter time frame than what we're looking at in your proposed time frames. So that's my question to you.
Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you, Mayor Brockett. I think you noted, and I would certainly concur, that there's value to looking at the entire area comprehensively. Certainly, as it comes to some of the infrastructure improvements, there's going to be a lot of really integrated and interconnected things that you do one thing at the south in terms of infrastructure or flood mitigation, that's going to have a cascade of effects of other utilities and infrastructure to the north. So we certainly would want to approach that holistically. In terms of the some of the regulatory functions of amending the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan land use map or introducing new zoning, those are the types of things that from an implementation standpoint could absolutely happen, I think, in a more phased approach where if an area needs or deserves some additional conversation around a proposed land use, for example, those changes and those ordinances could ultimately occur at a later time. But I do think there could be some opportunities to look at a few of these areas that perhaps have recommendations that feel right and really are consistent with our current community goals, and we could certainly look at moving forward on some of those land use and zoning changes more quickly in some of those particular areas. And I think hearing your feedback tonight is certainly going to help us move forward and sort of sharpen our pencils as we move back in and really refine the scope of work and the schedule. Those are the things that we can come back to you here later before the end of the year with more details on that.
Great, that's really helpful, Christopher. Well, I'll respond to that in my comments a little later after other people have had a chance to ask questions. Thanks.
All right, I see Lauren, then Tara.
Thanks, Matt. So my first question has to do with, I've heard about maybe a culvert going in under sort of the railroad in order to alleviate some flood issues. And I was just wondering how this does picking a timeline, the option A or option B, have any impact on how quickly those kinds of utility things might move forward?
I think we would see if Joe Tadiucci is on to perhaps answer that, unless Brad can take a bite at that apple.
I do not believe he is on today, but we can certainly take that back. Or Brad, you
Yeah,
may
yeah,
have
Joe's not, but we have talked a little bit about that. So just to make sure I followed your question, Lauren, just wondering, were you wondering about how the mapping would play into the overall planning process and timing? I just want to make sure I followed that correctly.
Well, I guess that my question is that, I mean, it seems like that update to help provide some, I mean, I'm assuming that that's to help reduce our, the area that's in the 100-year flood zone and the danger that's there. So is that, moving that forward, dependent at all on the rate at which we move the rest of this forward, or is that kind of going to run on its own track and
right
or not?
My understanding is that the Boulder Slough has already undergone the mapping phase, and that the next one is mitigation planning. Those are work program items, as Joe has related to me, that can be scheduled and prioritized with the plan. I think there's some independence between the two, but we can certainly take that question back and get back to you in more detail about it. We'll talk about this a little bit more as we go on, but we also have a planned November 10th work session with council, and that would be a opportunity where we could lay out all the various elements in a more detailed plan. So I could envision us bringing that then too.
Okay, thank you.
Lauren, do you mind if I add a little color to that? Oh,
sure.
Sorry. I was just, go ahead, Rachel. I was just going to add a little color based on a conversation I had with Joe that might help with where Lauren's going, but go ahead, Rachel.
Well, I just wanted to make sure I understood your question. Are you asking basically if we chose plan or option B, would that delay flood mitigation efforts for people who need it or for an area that needs it? Is that the question?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question is, some of those, is that a utility improvement that depends on this plan moving forward, or is it, unrelated, but work that's happening nearby on its own already?
Okay, thanks.
So there's a partner in here who's sort of a gorilla in the room. It was not literally in our room, but that's the railroad. And so that's a whole nother, beast of the whole thing. But what I gathered from I obviously what Brad said was right. But one thing I did pick up on is from Joe that they're just starting their work planning items. And remember, when we just passed the stormwater and flood master plan, we created a brand new prioritization criteria. And so based on how we indicate our priority for that southern section may change where a flood mitigation project may move up or down on that scale. So I think there are some considerations that utilities would take into account based on any acceleration or priority in terms of whether it's industrial or more housing in that space, because that would change how it's prioritized on the rubric that we just passed with the master plan. So they are kind of connected in how they would then prioritize and then move forward, and certainly work with Brad and his team on that process. So I think those pieces are kind of intrinsically connected based on where we set priorities for that southern section of Boulder Junction 2.
Thank you. And then my other question was, to me, it seems like the option B feels like it actually does include quite a bit more than option A. And I guess you're planning on adding more staffing to accomplish it faster. But to me, I was surprised that there is only the 6 to 9 month difference between the two. Do you feel confident in that assessment?
We do. Certainly this is a first pass at really kind of laying out a general scope of work and what we anticipate needing. I think the key for us during, as we were thinking about option B, is being strategic about what types of things we're reopening within the plan. Like, what questions are we asking? We certainly are not taking the approach, or wouldn't propose the approach, of scrapping everything that's there and starting over. We have a really great baseline to work from. We have some excellent outcomes from phase 1 that we can really lean on and learn from. So I think we would attempt to be pretty surgical, I think, about the land use or connections recommendations that we want to revisit, rather than really revisiting the whole thing. So I think that's partly how we think we could extend or expand the scope of the project and still maintain a relatively tight timeline for some of that expanded work.
Great, thank you.
Tara, you're up.
Actually, believe it or not, Lauren, those are my 2 questions. And now you said them so well. I only have comments now, so I'll wait.
Rachel, go for it.
Just one, I just want to understand if we, and I'm sorry if this is duplicative of what somebody else already asked, but if we go to option B here, does that have a ripple effect on other council priorities, such as occupancy, say, or ADUs?
Brad, you want to cover that?
Yeah, I can start with that one. We're going to talk about that a little more contextually in the second half of this. But the short answer is no. This already has been on a track before those others, and the key staff that are involved with it, we haven't had quite the same impacts. The kind of question around staffing on the mid to longer end of the overall project, we may be able to get some efficiencies with consultants. Certainly the idea that's been forth this evening, or the question of phasing some of the finer grain elements. But this is relatively independent of the others. Do you have anything else to add, Christopher, that based on our conversations?
No, I think that's right. I think, you hit the nail on the head in terms of the key staff that would be potentially involved with some of those code updates versus the expansion of the Boulder Junction work. We, two different groups of folks, and I think we'd be able to. I don't think that any expansion of the Boulder Junction work would have any effect on those code updates.
Thanks for that. Would it
Can I colloquy? Oh, sorry.
Sure, and just want to expand my question maybe. Would it have an impact on anything? Like, I hear a lot as a council member, well, we have a limited amount that we can do with the staff that we have, which I understand. So I just want to understand if we do, broaden this to the bigger option B timeline, is that going to impact anything else we might want to do or be doing?
Sure, I appreciate that question. In kind of very basic terms, the Boulder Junction 2 is handled by comprehensive planning staff. That's where we are most fully ramped up, and this being a fairly discrete project over multiple months wouldn't get impacted by some of the other kind of code changes and other priority projects. The other big one, and we'll touch on this, is the Area 3 research, where the question of resources comes into play relative to some of these planning projects as opposed to code update projects. does kind of relate to the longer time frame. And for that, we already in the budget, you'll see a request for an additional planner for comprehensive planning that would support this timeline, either of these two timelines as we've represented them, as well as a request for some consulting dollars.
Okay, thanks for that, Matt. I know you wanted to colloquy.
And yeah, so I just to maybe button that up, I totally understand that, you know, the code work is a different team than the comprehensive planning, but maybe more specifically, you know, if given the request for staffing, if we were to delay or sort of jettison the area 3 from sort of our current timeline of work plan, would that free up resources to shorten the timeline of option B, given that I'm assuming that that's part of the same comprehensive team, or would it be inconsequential if we move that off the plate in terms of affecting the option B timeline?
Yeah, I'll let Christopher kind of kick me under the table if he disagrees, but I think the answer is it would provide some efficiency. So if we were looking at that chart again, it would compress, but there are certain elements of this planning process that are sequential. So there's kind of a limit to how much of that we would be able to do. Can you put a finer point on that, Christopher, in terms of what months might be saved?
Yeah, I don't know if I can venture a guess in terms of specific timelines, but you're exactly right. I do think we, you know, obviously having staff, you know, generally the entirety of the team focused on this project would certainly help to accelerate certain aspects. I think one area that we run into in terms of these planning projects that option B is, you know, in terms of having to move forward with a plan amendment, something we can't avoid is just the process it takes to run through our boards and commissions and city council to ultimately get approval of that before we could move forward with land use updates and zoning updates and things like that. So that's kind of it's kind of a given, you know, that's going to take time to work through that entire process, but certainly the engagement piece, the development of alternatives and evaluation of those alternatives, we could potentially have some time savings there if we're able to, you know, really focus all of our staff on this one effort.
I don't want to, I know Tara's up next, and I see Rachel's hand up, so I don't know if she has a follow-up to continue or not. I didn't want to usurp that. Perhaps we can circle back to this question and maybe raise that to everyone on council, as if there's perhaps a preference or a desire on whether or not they want to lean towards moving area 3 to gain some efficiencies, or if we want to table that decision for another time. But we might circle back to that in the later part of this conversation, just to maybe give staff a little bit more clarity as to where council is on that particular issue, if that's all right with you, Brad.
Yep.
Okay. All right, Tara, you're up.
It sounds to me, well, you said you wanted to do option 2, correct? You leaning towards that. Is that not right, Brad?
Yeah.
And so since it sounds like it would be more work for you, you've got to have some pretty good reasons why you're leaning towards that. And I would assume it is because you do want to update what needs to be updated.
Yeah, fundamentally, the recognition that 15 years have passed and, you know, life in the world has changed then. A secondary and very important consideration too, that there are residents now where there hadn't been before. So there's a voice and voices there that could only be predicted in the past, but are known now. And then we do have some more robust tools available now, such as the racial equity tool and such. We would use those in both cases, but using that in conjunction with the outreach tools and outreach teams that have been developed since then, community connectors and those types of opportunities.
Does that cover what you needed, Tara? All right, Aaron, you're up, and then I'll take a bite at the apple unless someone else raises their hand.
Great. Well, if people don't mind with me starting with a little bit of background information here. So I don't know how many of you have talked to about this, but I went to a little 3-day Mayor's Institute of City Design conference several months ago, and brought this project forward for people to look at and discuss. And I have not gotten, they're going to get us formal follow-up materials about some of the analysis and recommendations and such, which I will had hoped would be ready by now and would have passed on if I had gotten them, but did not. So I'm just going to offer just a few high-level things that I heard from on that, and then I'll offer my own comments after that. The people so there were some design professionals there and some other mayors from other jurisdictions, and they noted what a fantastic opportunity this was for the city as one of a few redevelopable areas kind of left in town, and thought that given our current housing prices and the needs in our community, that it made sense to focus on housing as the driving kind of use in this area. And then noting the importance of knitting it together with the Boulder Junction Phase 1 and the uses to the west of the railroad tracks, and also uniting some of those transportation connections north-south within this area as well. And then the final thing, which is kind of beyond the scope of this, but just maybe something to think about, is the potential importance of placemaking here. That if it has a strong individual identity, that it could help draw people in and make it a kind of a crown jewel of Boulder, and not just an area that has a few apartment buildings. So I think those are the top level thoughts I got from that, which I thought all raised pretty good points. And then I'll turn then personally. So I'm going to go with the option B fundamentally here, because I think the land uses do need some updating, and in particular, I think they need to focus much more carefully on housing. I think we know how much of a need we have for housing in our community, and so I'd really like to see the land uses updated to reflect that. And so I think we do need a bit of a heavier lift in that area. On the transportation side, I'll say, in looking at it, I don't immediately have anything where I say, oh, well, that's really out of date. You should really do something else instead. So, but of course, I think we should have TAB look at it, right, to see if they think that it's up to date or would need revisions. Or maybe if we change the land uses, that might trigger some reevaluation of the transportation connections. My guess is not that much, but we'd certainly want to hear from TAB, in my opinion, on that. And then in terms of timing, I'm going to speak up for that sort of phased approach, because it would be fantastic to get something done before this council is done with our time. And partly it's just because it's, well, a lot of it's just for continuity's sake. That when councils turn over, there's inevitably some number of months of delay as folks shift priorities and things like that. And it's also really great to have a group of people see a project at least partially to fruition. So I'm going to put in a plug for some kind of phasing for the detailed land use and zoning changes going from south to north, and see if ask you all if you feel like it's possible maybe to get through the infrastructure piece, and then a first phase that we could finish out by the next fall kind of time frame. So maybe you'll come back to us and tell me that's totally impossible, and if so, that's the way it is. But I'd just love to hear from you if you do think that might be possible with that kind of approach. And what was our third question? It was further updates, which I've already given you. So those are my thoughts. I'm really excited to be getting going on this, and I do think it can turn out to be. Well, I'll just make this another comment. Let's make sure this is a special and unique place in the city of Boulder, right? So let's think about it as a unique place, and let's think about how this process, as we move through it, can really bring some additional character to our city and a special new place. Thanks.
Thanks, Aaron. I still had a couple questions. I know Aaron got into answering, which is great. All good. No, that's fine. Lauren, did you have more questions, or were you going to jump on to answering staff's questions? The latter. Awesome. Well, then I'll go to you next once I ask a couple about my upfront questions, and we'll jump into that probably for everyone else unless someone has some pre-questions. So couple questions I have is certainly in kind of where Aaron's comments were about really being intentional about housing and thinking about that sort of IMU 1 and 2 that currently exists, And thinking about, is there any restriction in really moving that towards an area that I think a lot of us were pretty happy with the East Boulder sub-community plan, was that sort of MU3 TOD, I mean, being so close to the Boulder Junction itself, transit-oriented development seems really ripe in certain parts of that area in proximity. And so I didn't know, in those revisions, is that kind of where you're thinking into building that kind of continuity with what we have in East Boulder sub-community and bridging that gap? And so I sort of wanted to ask about that in one sense, and then I have a question about office and industrial after that. So I'll start with the IMU 1 and 2 question.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for that question. Admittedly, we haven't gotten into a ton of detail on what changes we might think about or what alternative land uses we might put forward. But certainly, I do think that there is a lot of value in the work that was done just over, more recently, over 3 years in East Boulder around that station area master plan at 55th and Arapahoe, which is visionary and based on future transit, but we have an opportunity here where transit already exists, and hopefully RTD is able to, bring service back to this location as soon as possible. So I certainly that is a point that we would look to, immediately as one of our first options to evaluate and think about how we might make some adjustments. And certainly there's some benefit to, I think, a number of things. What we've learned out of East Boulder is going to help us move forward quickly on some of the changes that we might look at here. And also the fact that we already have form-based code in place. We might need to modify it, might need to update it, but we already have a lot of that structure already in place. And the general improvement districts already exist on the other side of the tracks. So we can look at whether or not simple expansion of that makes sense, as opposed to trying to set up and establish a new district. So I do think there's a lot of opportunities both within the existing elements that apply here, but also what we've learned more recently over the last couple of years that we can bring to bear in this project.
I appreciate that. I mean, that sort of generally answered my other question, just in terms of how much we're going to leverage that work that was just sort of across foothills. So I appreciate that. I think that's good synergy and leverages work that you already know has a lot of support, certainly from us and the community at large. So I appreciate that. I'm going to move over to Lauren so she can answer staff questions, and then hopefully everyone can chime in on their responses, and then we can hopefully synthesize what we're going to give guidance to staff on and keep the ball rolling. So I see Lauren, then I see Nicole.
Thanks, Matt, and thank you, staff, for the presentation and for your thinking on this and bringing forth multiple options. I think I am also leaning towards more of an option two. So much has changed since 2007, and I think that these plans represent really quite a long frame for development. This is something that we're going to be implementing for the next 15 years. And so we don't want to be implementing, 30-year-old thinking in 15 years. So I think it is really important for us to take advantage of some of the really smart choices that went into the East Boulder subcommunity plan. Like Matt was talking about, the transit-oriented districts sort of around the transit hubs. I also really appreciated how that plan had housing, specifically tried to take any area that had sort of green space and rapid in housing. I think that something like that could be appropriate here as well. And as you mentioned, we have more residents living nearby that should have a say in how this area gets developed, as well as, new tools like our racial equity tool that I would really like to see play a bigger role in how we're thinking about these very important decisions. I also would really like to see us try to think more deeply about how we can pick the best zoning types to really reduce our climate impact. So what are the sort of, if we were going to look at this just through a climate lens, what kind of zoning would we pick for these areas based on that? And so I would really like to see EAB also involved in this as we move forward with looking at what this is new zone, or what modifications we might make. And then I guess, like Aaron, I'm a little bit less sure about the transit plan, and if that still makes sense, I would really be interested to see how TAB feels about it, and if they think that it needs significant updates or not. Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. I see Nicole, then Tara.
I'm just going to echo what everybody else has said. Yes, option B makes the most sense to me as well, for all the reasons everybody's already stated. The one thing I will just bring that comes out of our Dr. Cog meeting last night and approving the greenhouse gas mitigation reduction plan there is that they're going to be offering technical assistance and things as well for communities that are interested in trying to build more housing along high transit areas and corridors. And so that, it sounds like, is just going to be available to communities that wish to use it. I know we have a lot of resources here in our city already and people who know about that, but just wanted to offer that. It's something that they are going to be developing and preparing and will have available to communities like ours if we need it.
Thanks, Nicole. Tara, you're up.
Found the mute button. Good for me. Okay, let me just get my notes. I would like to slow down, and definitely I'm on up with option B. One thing I would like to do is be honest and talk about what has worked in TVAP 1, what hasn't worked, what isn't that great, what is great. I don't want to be a negative Nelly, but when I was reading the TVAP plan, that was a lot of pages that we had to read. A lot of it was words like vibrant and community center, and some of the areas are not vibrant, nor are they community centers. So some of the areas, and so I'd love the opportunity to do a what is the pandemic has.
Hey, Tara, I don't think we can hear you. You're breaking up a bit. Do you want to maybe just turn off your screen and then maybe provide that input, and maybe we can then hear what you're saying?
Maybe, can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's much better.
Okay. Maybe I'm not talking clearly because I don't feel.
I think we're still losing you. We're just hearing every 10th word. Tara, why don't we pause, see if it just sort of improves itself? Why don't I move to Mark and Junie, and if we can get a sense of your connection improving, we'll circle back to you in just a little bit. Sound good? Mark, you're up.
Okay, thanks. I am also going to be supportive of option B. I'm less concerned with how long it takes, although doing it expeditiously is better. But I'm more concerned with getting it right. I think Tara's initial comments before she became garbled were correct. One of the things we ought to be looking at is where are the successes and failures in TVAP 1, and let's not repeat the mistakes, and let's emphasize the things that are good and that have worked well. So for me, instead of relying upon a 15-year-old plan, I would much prefer that we do option B and really look at this with new eyes and with current understandings of transportation, of what kinds of housing we want, kinds of housing we need, et cetera. So I'm very supportive of that. I would not abandon the urban services study for Area 3. This is these parcels of land, if annexed, could provide a significant opportunity not just for housing, but for affordable and potentially middle-income housing, either through community benefit agreements, if we annex private properties, and at our own discretion if we own the properties. So I would not walk away from that under any circumstances, because I think we're not going to run out of need for housing. If we could do TVAP 2 tomorrow, we'd still need more housing. So I think the Area 3, the planning reserve is an important asset, and we ought to be moving forward in looking at that as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. Let's check back in to Tara Junie and see if her connection works, and then we'll circle back to you. Does that work?
Let Junie go. Junie, go.
All right. Thank you, Tara. This is great. I am in full support of the comment made by Mark about Area 3. I was a strong proponent of the study being done because of the very reason mentioned by Mark, which is affordable housing and workforce housing, which is something that is greatly needed in the community. But I was looking at, to answer the question, I agree, option B, because even looking at some of the processes, it seems option B offers a little bit more, which I welcome. And when I was looking at the slide as well, and I thought Lauren was going to mention that because she's the architect in the room, about our architecture and the importance of ensuring that there is some level of beauty in the way that we do this work. Also, on page 25, I welcome the additional multi-use path and pedestrian connection. I think that's very important. You also mentioned the racial equity tool, especially in this type of project. Sometimes it's hard to find, okay, how do we ensure that we bring equity into the work, into this type of work? Sometimes we don't see it because it feels so concrete, but I really appreciate that as well. I appreciate the comment that you made, actually, Tara. You were going to say something about being community-centered, and I think that was great as well. That is very important. And also there was a comment about, actually in one of the slides, about tailored community engagement. That's very important because it's not enough to just do community engagement. It's more important that we ensure that it is tailored to the community. That's where I'll leave it for now. And thank you. That's really great work.
Thank you, Junie.
It's great to go last. That's all I can say. Everybody said practically everything I was going to say.
Well, do you want me to go so you can still go last, Tara?
No.
Okay.
No.
All right,
Can you
go
hear
for
me?
it.
Can
Yeah,
you hear me?
you sound great. Go for it.
So I'm not going to, well, I'll just repeat a few things. Yes, on beauty. Yes, this is the opportunity. Really, this is a great opportunity to make something beautiful, to make something that really is a community center. So going back to looking at what is not a community center and what is a community center in the current TVAP, in the current Boulder Junction, would be a really good idea. I want to say that, to me, listening to the community that lives there and the community connectors is probably one of the most important things, because when you're far away from it, we don't live there, let's say, there are certain things that we don't know. We don't know, well, we do know because people write to us for sure, but it will be best to hear from them before we make any, what I would call, of the same mistakes. I'm not saying we're making mistakes, but it would be good to know if we have made mistakes, to not do them over again. So everybody else said great things, and I don't need to repeat them. So I'm going to go with door number 2.
Thanks, Tara. Junie, I still see your hand up. Did you have something else to add? Oh, all right.
Sorry.
We haven't heard from Rachel on the questions yet. So Aaron, do you mind if I roll to Rachel, or were you going to build on something someone else said, Aaron?
Yep, do other people first. I just had one more thought.
Awesome. Go ahead, Rachel. You're muted, Rachel. And what you said was probably really eloquent, so we missed it.
Good. I'll never be able to duplicate it. I'm supportive of the option B as well. And to Tara's point about engagement, I do think that people who live at Boulder Junction now are probably in a good position to give us important feedback. And I think we have 2 boards, and I don't remember if that was specifically built in, but along with planning and tab, I would think those 2 boards should have a lot of good input as we're looking at what has and hasn't worked. And as I recall, it's hard to fill those boards. So that's one thing that's not working. I mean, something about the process already isn't great. So let's include them and figure out maybe how we can do some of that better.
Thanks, Rachel. Aaron, go ahead and add your comment and feedback, and then I'll answer those staff questions after you.
Great. Just one thought I forgot to include was just in terms of efficiencies, that we have just gone through the East Boulder sub-community planning process, and that area of town is very similar to this area of town. And so I think rather than reinventing all of the wheels, I think we could borrow some of those ideas. So obviously we want to do the community outreach and the things that folks have said about outreach to nearby neighbors, and the community connectors are really important, and applying the racial equity tools. So not to predetermine anything, but as we get that feedback, if we look at some of the tools or some of the methods that we applied to the East Boulder sub-community plan, we could maybe use some pre-existing work that we've done to get a great outcome here that also is a little bit more efficient. So just want to throw that idea out there as well.
Thanks, Aaron. So, before I answer let's see. I can answer the question, and then I'll look to clarify from Brad and maybe Christopher and Sarah on a point that sort of seemed to be brought up by some of my colleagues. So I mean, I'll just make this sort of unanimous that option B is my preferred direction. We all, as soon as we set a plan, we deal with obsolescence pretty quickly with how things change. So modernizing it as much as possible, and if we could somehow just prognosticate the future 15 years from now and make a plan for that, wouldn't life be great? We'd have flying cars and all those things already. But so I think that option B is the way to go. I did want to clarify and ask Brad a question, and maybe that helps clarify Mark and Junie's concerns about Area 3. Is there a critical path from which studying Area 3 has to be done by in order to be incorporated into the next round of the Boulder Valley Comp Plan? I'm just wondering, do we have are we already at that point where if we don't start it now, we miss that window, or do we have some grace period that we can work with regards to delaying it, but not missing that important window, which is really the whole point of the urban study, is to have it ready for the comp plan conversation. So I'm just wondering, timing wise, do we have something to work with there? Or are we already sort of, borrowed for time?
Yeah, Matt, that's an excellent question, and I'm afraid I simply don't know the answer. Maybe Christopher, or we've got some other staff who can. I will offer up that, this is the basic tension of comprehensive planning, which is the not urgent but important. And so our instincts as planners are to want to move all things forward all the time, because we know this day of reckoning, so to speak, will come on all things long-range planning. But there is, and obviously must be, a prioritization at the same time. I would suspect this will be the greater part of our conversation in November, a little bit on the second half, but certainly at the retreat as well. So, but to the mechanical question of its relationship to the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan, I'll defer to others on staff here.
Yeah, I'm happy to chime in on that a bit. I mean, the next major update for the comprehensive plan is scheduled for 2025, which, of course, will be upon us before we know it. But the completion of that baseline urban services study, in order to inform those conversations and be referenced within the document, really we have until that date. So it could be completed next year. It could be completed in 24. Before we get into that 2025 major update. And even though I am new to the city, what I have seen in terms of those major updates to the comprehensive plan is that they often tend to not occur actually right on schedule on 2025. So that could, conceivably even extend into 26. Hopefully not, if I have anything to do with it, but certainly that could happen.
I appreciate that. That adds a little bit of context to it. I guess what I'm hearing is that um, we do have a little bit of time, is what I'm kind of hearing. Maybe not exactly known, and maybe there's greater context in November as to what that might look like. And then maybe if I've also heard from from the conversation about where the planning department's work is it seems to be more front loaded on TVAP, and towards the end is where you're starting to check in with boards and commissions, and then that's sort of just a fixed delay because it's got to go to a meeting, and then a month later it's got another meeting, and then a month later another, and those are just baked in based on the virtue of the cadence of meetings and feedback. But the heavy lifting is done maybe in that first half to 2/3. Do I understand that correct?
Yeah, generally from a workload standpoint, and certainly the creation of new materials, yes, most of that is really front loaded in terms of engaging the community, listening to people, creating alternatives, and then refining those, ultimately landing on a preferred option. The second half of the project is a lot of sort of rote adoption processes through our boards and commissions, through council, and then if we do a plan amendment, there's a planning portion of that, but then there's also implementing any ordinances that would actually change the code or change zoning, and that type of thing. So within our current, window of the 22 to 24 months that we were anticipating for phase 2 or for option B, that does include or attempts to try to incorporate some of those additional implementation steps. So it's not necessarily just to get to a plan amendment in 24 months. We think we might be able to actually, do some of those other code updates and implementation steps as well within that time frame.
All right, that's helpful context. And I just wanted to then circle back to Mark and Junie with concerns about Area 3. If there was a desire to gain those efficiencies, because I definitely want to make sure that whatever we do with Area 3 is incorporated in the comp plan. We probably all share that intention, but would you be amenable if we delayed the start of the Area 3 to gain efficiencies, knowing that by still starting it, 9 months from now or a year, we still get it done in time for it to be ultimately incorporated into the comp plan? Is that, because I'm trying to see, can we have our cake and eat it? Is more or less what I'm kind of asking. And I think what I'm hearing from Brad and Christopher is we probably can with regards to this. And so Mark, Junie, since you had those concerns, I just want to circle back knowing that now. Does that change your thoughts on whether you want to gain efficiencies by delaying Area 3?
No, it really doesn't, Matt. I look at the Area 3 as a greater opportunity for affordable and middle income housing than TVAP 2, which is basically going to be market rate housing in whatever configuration we permit, with either cash in lieu or 25% affordable. Area 3, as I said, to the extent that there are properties out there that the city owns, we have full discretion as to what we want to do with it. And with respect to properties we don't own, if they want to be annexed, we have much greater leverage in terms of getting a favorable deal that can produce housing, above 25% affordability levels. So to me, in a lot of ways, both properties are going to be there. Nothing's going to disappear, but the urgency for affordable and middle income housing is such that I actually think the Area 3 property is as important, if not more so, than TVAP 2, which is basically going to, as I said, basically be a market rate driven development. So I would be very reluctant to do that.
All right, I appreciate you clarifying. Tara, I see your hand up, and then we can maybe button this up. Yeah.
Quick question. When we had our tours to the East Boulder Sub-Community Plan areas, that really helped me. I'm a very visual person, and to be able to see it made a big difference. And I'm wondering if before the November meeting, can we have another tour? I'd love to go see extensively what areas, even looking at TVAP 1, even looking at the areas that did and didn't work, and then going to the next section and checking that out. And I think visualizing will really help at least me.
I'm sure we can.
Love a field trip.
Yeah, love it.
Happy to work with you to set that up.
Wonderful. I think that's a great idea, Tara. Thanks for bringing that up. We all love our field trips, preferably when the weather's nice. That would be nice. So let's see if we can wrap this up, and then and make sure if there's any clarifying from staff. But it looks pretty. It looks like unanimously we want to move with option B. So I think that's really clear guidance for staff with regards to those first two questions. And then sort of one that's and then there's a one comment that I think kind of got also repeated, or at least got tacked onto, was one that was really kind of initiated by Aaron, which was really looking first, obviously looking at the whole area, but sort of quickly starting to think about in implementation, breaking this up into phases and sort of thinking about it from a south to north perspective. But as we look at those things, being really intentional with housing, and really leaning into that aspect and intentionality seem to be a theme as well, as we move forward. And I think staff, certainly you guys have nodded your heads that, yeah, that you're leaning that too, but I think it's just to be clear that was, I think, sort of what we heard broadly. And I did want to circle, because I know we're going to talk about it in November, but I just kind of wanted to get a sense from my colleagues, is there, even though we chose B, is there interest in gaining any efficiency with regards to Area 3? We heard from Mark and Junie that they're not interested in that, but I did want to hear from everybody else, because that might be indication for staff in terms of how they want to think of things in preparation for November. And so I would just maybe quickly just sort of throw out just a quick straw poll. If you want to raise your hand, are you interested in trying to find efficiency by any kind of delays to Area 3? Is that of interest to anybody on council? All right, well, that answers that question. There's just two of us that are interested in that. All right.
Yeah. And Mark, can I
Aaron,
just
you had a
clarify?
point? Yep.
Yeah, well, and I just want to say that I was interested to the extent that we could still get Area 3 done 100% within the comprehensive plan window. So just in no way wanted to delay that, but as long as that wasn't a threat.
Right. And I think we heard that. You go ahead, Lauren.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to that. I think that there might be other reasons, like other priorities that I might choose to put in front of Area 3, but in general, I think that I trust staff to balance their schedule. I mean, I think that largely we all agree that we want to make sure that this is done for the comprehensive plan, and it is a super important, as Mark said, area for us to look at. So I don't want to jeopardize it, but I also don't want to micromanage how things are lined up on the planning and development services schedule. I also just wanted to mention that I'm not sure that the south to north, I would need to look at that in more detail before I would feel comfortable saying like, that is a plan that I solidly agree with and support. I trust staff to, if there are pieces that it makes sense to bring forth more quickly for the phase 2, I'm open to that. But for me, it's not, having it done right and with the strong engagement is my priority.
Thanks, Lauren. So I think we're clear on option 3 going forward. Any last comments before we move on? All right, I think we're all good. Thanks for staff's presentation. Thanks for clarifying a lot of our questions. And just a last check-in with Brad, Sarah, and Christopher. Do you think you've got what you needed from us to move forward, not just on Boulder Junction 2, but certainly preparation for the November 10th meeting?
Yes. Thanks.
Yep. Good.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Well, just to recognize, also, this is Sarah's first meeting in front of council as a new person. So great job, Sarah. Nice work. And KJ as well. We haven't seen you, so thank you. You guys did great. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, and thanks for everyone's comments. I think that buttons up our conversation on Boulder Junction. And Nuria, do I want to turn it back to you for our transition to our next subject?
Well, the transition remains with PNDS because they had a part 2 to today's discussion.
Oh, that's right.
So
You're right.
I will send that to Brad.
Great call.
Yes, and I will qualify that this is much more informational at this point. It is really kind of a preparatory discussion leading up to the November 10th work session that's planned. So this is just giving a broader picture, because we are comprehensive planners of the broader landscape of planning projects. So take it away, Christopher.
Thanks, Brad. Yes, I will continue to be in the hot seat here this evening. So when you pull the presentation back up, we've got a few more slides to run through. That's great. The next slide will get us going. Great, thank you. So yeah, as Brad mentioned, this really is intended to be informational and really set the stage for that November 10th meeting where we can get into much more details and decision making about a number of things really across our department. So we're going to begin just by providing a reminder of the 5 council priorities that involve our department directly, and then we're going to highlight just a few other ongoing and unscheduled items that are on the radar and sort of circling within the department. Next slide, please. So as we've been talking about, Boulder Junction Phase 2 obviously was a priority that came out of the retreat. Area 3 that you can see there highlighted at the north end of the city, highlighted in B, and then the 3 code update items that really are intended to modernize the code in relation to accessory dwelling units, affordable housing, and occupancy. Next slide. In addition, of course, there are ongoing things or things that have come up recently that are also, on the radar and on the menu for us to be thinking about as we move in. So there's a number of implementation projects that are continuing to come out of the sub-community plan, a number of zoning studies, some creation of form-based code, infrastructure planning, et cetera, that would be that we will continue to be moving forward with and implementing that plan as hopefully it leads toward adoption on October 6th. We also, if you recall, committed to creating a civic area historic district. This was an outcome of the decision not to expand the landmark boundary of the band shell, and really the importance of looking at this area holistically rather than on that piecemeal basis. So the challenge, I think, associated with that civic area historic district is really the intimate connections with the work that Parks and Recreation is imminently moving forward with on their phase 2 of the civic area master plan. And then some of the previous land use planning work that our department was involved in on the east bookend that was ultimately put on hold back in 2018 after the existing conditions and the inventory task was completed. Next slide. And in particular, a lot of that civic area work is really falling into the context of a number of other projects that are focused on downtown currently, and whether they be led by city departments or others, things like the downtown vision plan that's ongoing, certainly the recent conversations around the future of West Pearl and mobility study in that particular area. And also thinking about connectivity to the CU Boulder campus and improving those connections between campus and downtown, particularly as it relates to new hotel and conference center that is set to begin here fairly soon. We recognize that not only is there just a tremendous amount of attention being focused on downtown right now, but also there's a time component of all these items, and the fact that they're all sort of aligning in terms of their timing is somewhat unusual. And we see that presented, really as a tremendous opportunity for a lot of cross-disciplinary collaboration, not only within our city departments, but with our stakeholders and community leaders as well. So really offering a chance to think comprehensively about all of these components together. Next slide. And then finally, I would be remiss if I didn't remind you about all the ongoing annual and daily work that our department is responsible for. That's our annual capital improvements plan, our department master plans that fall under our wing. All manner of applications and permits and development cases, particularly our historic preservation and our development review teams. And then thinking ahead towards, perhaps the next sub-community plan. What does that look like and where is that located? Thinking about already some of the initial pre-work for that major update of the comprehensive plan in 2025. So really the goal here is just to simply, not to just present to you and say we're busy, because I think you know that, but it's really just to provide a reminder and an overview of all the items that we are thinking about and attempting to balance and consider as we start thinking about our work planning for next year, and really hoping that we can continue to make a lot of progress on the council priority projects, within the context of all these other things happening. So we've got one more slide, and I think Brad is going to close that out, and then we'll move into the next discussion section.
Yeah, thank you, Christopher. And as Christopher has mentioned, and I've alluded to, and others, we will be coming back to you in about 6 weeks or more with details and thoughts on how we can really strategically balance these and honor and recognize the priorities for council and prioritize these various work items. I want to relay that we have had success in filling some very important staffing positions, both within comprehensive planning and development review. Some of those were just on the cusp of as well, but it certainly did result in delays even while we've been fairly successful in getting those staffed up and but onboarding those folks and getting people familiar. In the meantime, though, we do continue to make good progress on important efforts like finalizing the land use table updates and refining the scope of work for Boulder Junction by the end of the year, which again will be part of what we bring forward in November as well. And in early 2023, we look forward to finalizing the priorities with you at the council retreat. And we would anticipate initiating the ADU code update work during that period, and completing the update to the site review criteria that you've seen earlier, and formally starting Boulder Junction 2, as we've talked about tonight. And then the other items that we've itemized this evening being part of that broader discussion in the next 6 weeks here. So I believe that concludes our presentation. Matt, if you want to advance to the last slide for discussion, and any last thoughts that council has on this bigger picture.
Thanks, Brad. Thanks, Christopher. Anyone got any comments or feedback on this before we move on? Going once, going twice. All right. I'll just add one. I'd love to see us, since we've been talking a lot about comprehensive planning, I'd like to see as much of an acceleration on getting the ADU stuff done, because it's pretty, I think as we identified it at the retreat, was really just a couple targeted code changes. And because we've not long ago already went through a lot of community input on ADUs, I think we can knock that out much faster than maybe otherwise we could think. If we just lay out what 3 we want and get to code, I think we could turn that around pretty quickly. So I just would hope that we can find some ways to do that. I see Aaron's hand up. Go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, I agree with what Matt just said, but I didn't see occupancy on that list anywhere.
That may have simply been an oversight, but that certainly is on the list. Aaron, thank you.
Okay, good to hear. Thanks.
Yeah, Aaron, it was on a couple slides earlier. It was on that, just maybe not at the final slide. But
well, no, I saw it the earlier one, but I didn't see it on the schedule. And so
yeah,
the question is, where is it on the schedule?
Fair enough. So, all right, any other thoughts, comments, feedback before we head to November 12th or November 10th meeting? All right. Well, that was fast. Appreciate it. Again, Brad, Christopher, Sarah, thank you so much. Really appreciate you guys working through this. We look forward to seeing you again in just a handful of weeks and going through those next little pieces as we start to knock out the rest of these retreat priorities, and look forward to hearing some more updates on that going forward. So thank you. Appreciate it.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
All right, Nuria, take 2 back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. And so tonight we're going to come to you and talk on our second topic about discussing not a new topic, and really at the request of you all in council. We've been discussing library funding and governance for years now. And certainly we all know that there's a ballot item that's considering creating a library district in the near future. If the district is passed by voters, there are a series of actions and steps that that will need to occur. And while tonight isn't really about discussing all of those items, I just wanted you to know that staff is really ready and will be prepared to bring to council a comprehensive outline of that information in November, should that ballot item indeed pass. The conversation tonight is about the potential reallocation of the funds that are currently used to provide library services. This is the beginning of that conversation that, if the library district is passed by voters in the fall, will continue into 2023. Tonight, we'll be seeking initial council thoughts on the subject, and so we'll appreciate all the feedback that you can give us. Additionally, we know and we want to clarify some of the information about the property tax portion of the library funding, and I know that staff will be talking about that as well. So with that, I'll introduce Cara Skinner, who along with Mark Wolf and Teresa Tate will be presenting this item. Cara?
Thank you, Naria. And I believe Mark will pull up the presentation. Great. Thank you, Naria. Cara Skinner, I'm Chief Financial Officer. And I think we can move right on to the next slide. Thank you, Mark. So as Nuria mentioned, we are here this evening as council requested a discussion on the process, the timing, and priority making for the reallocation of the budget that we do believe would be available beginning in 2024 should voters approve the library district in November. So our presentation agenda, as you see here, items 2 through 5 relate to that scheduled discussion. And Mark Wolf, our Senior Budget Manager, will take us through that portion of the presentation. However, as Nuria mentioned, before we get to that scheduled conversation, we do want to take a few minutes to clarify with council and the community the impact of the city's ballot issue 2C and the library mill levy. So for that conversation, I will welcome our City Attorney, Teresa Taylor Tate, for the clarification.
Thank you so much. So as council is aware, but we want to make the public aware as well, following the publication of the staff memo for tonight's discussion, questions arose about the impact of repealing certain provisions of city charter related to the library, specifically under ballot item 2C, and with respect to the council's intent of the ballot question and the ballot title. So these questions prompted further discussion, research, and ultimately consultation with an outside expert in elections law. After one-on-one conversations with each council member, it's clear that the supermajority of council intended that ballot question 2C, if passed, would repeal the tax and taxing authority of the 0.333 mill levy. So tonight we'll present the council action that will be required to effectuate that repeal of that mill levy should the voters approve the library district and city ballot question on 2C. And I'll turn it back over to Cara and Mark to discuss the mechanism for doing that.
Thank you, Teresa. So as Teresa indicated, if both measures pass, both the library district ballot issue and the city ballot issue 2C, staff will then bring to council for council consideration an emergency ordinance to revise the 2022 mill levy ordinance, which you will be considering and approving in October, to reduce the total city mill levy by that 0.33 mills. So as you know, we always present the mill levy ordinance and the budget without anticipating a certain result of the November election. So the mill levy ordinance you'll be considering in October does not presume those ballot measures pass. So if they do pass, we will bring something to you at the meeting following the election in November, and it will need to be passed on emergency ordinance to reduce the mill levy by that 0.333. And with that, then I'll hand it over to Mark.
All right. Good evening, Council. Mark Wolf, Senior Budget Manager. So I'll now take you through a few slides related to the current library budget, the amount available for reallocation upon district creation, and the proposed process. Starting here, this slide has a few parts, beginning with the 2023 recommended library budget. You'll notice here that the recommended budget includes appropriation of the library fund, which includes the 0.33 mill levy. If the district is approved and the mill levy is repealed, we will need to identify another source of funding for library operations in lieu of the property tax for 2023. And that amount is approximately $1.4 million. As a reminder, if the district is approved, 2023 would likely be a transition year. The city would continue to operate the library as a city service through 2023, and then the city would likely be repaid by the library district, subject to future negotiation, for the total cost of operating the library. That repayment could begin as early as 2024. And again, details related to such would be worked out through an intergovernmental agreement negotiated between the city and the district if the district passes in November. So related to what we're talking about this evening primarily is this amount that is or would be available for reallocation. So a couple notes here. You'll see the projected general fund library budget of 9.25 to 9.75 million for 2024. And then additional, what we're calling direct general fund savings, again, a range of $500,000 to $1 million. So the number that we're targeting this evening and planning ahead for that potential reallocation is that $9.75 to $10.75 million. I also note that that includes the North Boulder operating expenses. Again, that is expected to open late in 2023. I also want to acknowledge that these numbers, that 9.75 to 10.75, differ from what was contained in the staff memo. And again, that difference is the revenue from the 0.33 mill levy is no longer included, as we're anticipating that would be repealed if the district were to pass. All right, one more number slide. This slide is to emphasize the amount that is estimated to be available for reallocation. Again, that's in the first column on the left here. This amount includes all direct costs to operating the system. So that's all staffing, what you would see represented within the library budget within your budget package. It does not include such indirect costs that would not result in those direct cost savings. So parts of other positions that support the library is a good example of that. And it does not include other foundational or grant support that's represented within the library fund. It's part of the total budget, but wouldn't be cash savings that the city could spend if available after the district was created. So that's how you start to get a different number from what is available for reallocation versus what is the true full cost to the city of operating a library. So that's in the middle column. So that includes annualizing certain maintenance costs. It includes all administrative overhead costs. So you imagine all of the other finance and city attorney support that the library would receive, does receive in addition to many other departments. So that total cost is much bigger than the cash that is available for reallocation. There are probably some other savings, as we've talked about, mostly in efficiencies and being able to allocate staff time elsewhere. But in terms of cash that we're anticipating to be available, again, that's in the left column. And then lastly, just acknowledging that there are some other future liabilities or future costs that we would be, quote, avoiding with the district being created, such as other maintenance that we would be anticipating, the incremental costs of personnel, insurance, and other types of service expansions. All right, so now I'll start talking about our recommended approach to looking at the potential reallocation and prioritizing our needs. So we have begun the process, and we do this on a regular basis, looking across departments and inventorying our needs from a work planning standpoint, from a budget standpoint. But also if there are opportunities such as this, we want to have a good sense of what is missing in terms of the funding picture going forward. So we have started that process with our departments. We are discussing that a potential process now. And what we're suggesting is that we work through Council's Financial Strategy Committee on a prioritization of those needs for Council review sometime over the winter to help inform the budget process for 2024. And again, because those dollars, the soonest that those dollars would be available would be for reallocation within the 2024 budget. We think it's prudent to look at that budget process, which would include all of our needs and all of our funding sources. That would be the appropriate time to look across our entire budget and make those decisions. So your recommendations in advance, just like council priorities in that time frame as well, help inform our work planning and our budget planning. So what might this categorization or prioritization look like? What we're suggesting is to organize ourselves across 5 different areas: core operational needs, programs and services, program and service enhancements aligned with established policy, new investments aligned with established policy, new expanded investments to meet emerging community needs. And then we have spent some time in the past talking about potential additional tax relief and rebate considerations. So what do we mean by all of this? Core operational needs, again, might be pretty straightforward, but essentially these are the critical investments to maintain our existing service levels, and lack of funding would implicate some type of service reduction. So these are things like facility maintenance, snow plowing, median maintenance, sidewalk repairs, software replacement, maintenance of our fiber system, parks maintenance, et cetera. This would also include investments, continued investments in our city staff. We've highlighted this through the 2023 process. And again, we'll likely need those continued investments to stay competitive as a workplace. Program service enhancements aligned with established policy. So essentially, these are investments to existing programs or services that are aligned with existing policies. Existing policies, the easiest is to think about accepted department master plans. A couple examples are continued implementation. So areas that we've already made investments, such as advanced life support services, emergency medical services within our fire department, our Vision Zero goals within transportation. Again, we have made some investments there, but likely more to come. New investments align with established policies. So in this area, we may have a policy that's been accepted or adopted by council, and we have not yet begun to make progress within a goal area. So one example could be the facilities master plan. So certainly that plan calls for the build out of the Alpine Balsam campus. That's on the capital side, but if there's a significant city investment on that site in pursuit of our goals, there's likely some debt service associated with that. So that would be an ongoing expense, a new investment in alignment within an accepted master plan. Another may be some of our additional climate action goals and programming associated with meeting our climate action goals. We know that there is the ballot initiative in November, but that will not cover all of our needs in terms of meeting our climate goals from a programming perspective. New or expanded investments to meet emergency community needs. So sometimes there are community needs that come up that may not be specifically called out in an existing plan, but nonetheless are something that we need to address in a short period of time. So example of this is the funding that we have proposed in the 23 budget to start a day services center. Our behavioral health program is another. We also have several programs that are identified with ARPA funding. These are all one-time uses of funds that implicate ongoing services or ongoing need. So again, with a really interesting opportunity to look at ongoing costs. Again, this funding, that if it does come available, is ongoing in nature. It's an opportunity to look at some of these ongoing needs. And lastly, the consideration of additional tax relief or rebates. We were asked to put together some thought around this. We could look at certain rebate programs targeted at certain community members. That could be a property or sales tax rebate in some way. We could also look at an overall reduction in the sales tax rate or property tax credit for a certain period of time. Again, we'd want to use caution and be thoughtful about how we use those mechanisms, but that certainly is within the council's purview. And then just for your reference, 1 mil is equivalent today, around $4.2 million, and 0.1% sales tax is equivalent to about $4.5 million. And this slide you have seen 2 weeks ago, so I won't get too far into it, but these are the types of pieces of information that we'll be refining. This is not a comprehensive list, but gives you an idea of scale. The number is big, the number is likely to be bigger as we complete our inventory. So that really does necessitate some type of prioritization with council to determine how we may use this money and then also structure our future budgets. So as we build out this list of unfunded needs, broader than the last slide, what does this prioritization exercise look like? What we're suggesting again is to work through council's financial strategy committee on the specifics. However, a prioritization is likely to include looking at alignment with our sustainability, equity, and resilience goals. Other considerations for prioritization could be ongoing versus one-time, reflecting that opportunity to look at addressing ongoing costs, and then some type of weighing of the different categories that we've presented, at least getting a sense of where we should be focusing our efforts. So that concludes a very brief presentation, but essentially we're trying to tee up council to get some reaction on that process, and also hear some early thoughts as to whether or not you all have some ideas for emphasis on those categories, or at least would like to help focus some of our inventory and gathering information for future council consideration prioritization. Hand it back to you, Matt.
Thanks, Mark. Kara, thank you for this presentation, and thanks for clarifying certainly the item 2C on our ballot. That's really helpful for us on council and also the community. I appreciate that. Certainly going to open it up to, why don't we just start with sort of that first question about sort of process and reallocation. I will sort of just remind everybody that we will be making the 2024 budget. It is this body that will do that. And so the reallocation of these funds, should the library district get passed, it will be up to us to decide that in a formal sense when we start our budget process next year. And so there's no passing the buck, there's no making decisions on others. And so I think it's important to know that this is good planning for decisions we as a body will ultimately make. And also in terms of timing, that this is exactly when most departments are already starting to think roughly about what buckets they're looking to put money into in preparation for that. So the timing of this conversation, even though it coincides with a ballot measure, is actually really appropriate with regards to where other departments are doing that planning. And so I think just sort of working from that foundation, we can sort of march forward. Once we answer that first question, I know as wheels are turning, I do want to sort of point out that let's try not to get into dollars and cents and hyper specifics of programs. I think let's talk about buckets and more or less, because I think the details will come later. And I think certainly the budget team and Mark and Kara have demonstrated, certainly as what we saw with the last budget, they're pretty good at hearing what our priorities are and finding those investment points around that. So I think they do a pretty good job if we can highlight those buckets. So without that out of the way, I'll turn it back to help me answering that process of number one, the question number one, and I see Nicole's hand up, so go for it.
just had a pre-question before getting there, just a point of clarification. So we're really just talking about reallocating kind of some of what it currently costs us to run the library. So if I'm understanding correctly, when we're estimating the savings that we'll actually realize in terms of what we can reallocate to other purposes, we're not really looking at the total cost of running and maintaining the library. So the operating cost that we're looking at that comes from the general fund is excluding building maintenance, for example, capital maintenance, improvements, things like that. Am I understanding that correctly? I just want to make sure I wrap my head around this the right way.
That's correct. There is some building maintenance that we built into those direct cash savings, if you will, that would be available for reallocation. There's a larger bucket that includes future larger maintenance projects that are not built into that we plan for, and also kind of general administrative overhead, which is more indirect, that's not represented in the cost savings that would be available for reallocation.
Okay, yep. So we're talking about just kind of this portion of $9 to $10 million or so that covers some of the operating costs, but not kind of the full cost of running the library. And I think that's a place where I'm just hearing a lot of confusion out in the community. And I think sometimes even in our conversations here as to like, what does it actually cost us to have the libraries as a part of our budget? So thank you for clarifying. I think it's really important for us, especially as we're talking about it in front of the community, to help everybody recognize that $9 or $10 million, that's not the entire cost of the library, that there's more there. And can you put those questions back up? I'm happy to answer them now, unless other people have clarifying questions they want to get to first.
Well, yeah, I think, Nicole, we're going to just answer that first question. So thanks for priming the question up there. Yeah, just in terms of just questions about the process. Let's just sort of start there, and then we can dive into the buckets, because obviously I think that's where the meat on the bone is here in this conversation. But if we can knock out the first one, which may inform the second, let's go ahead and do that.
Awesome.
Aaron, I see your hand. Go for it.
Yeah, Nicole, did you have any other questions? I just didn't want to.
That was my main question for now.
Okay, great, thanks. Well, just to build a little bit on what Nicole was saying. So there are categories of expenses like the building maintenance, right? That aren't included, but also I think, as I understand it, I just want to make sure I understand this correctly, that there will be things where there will be areas in terms of staff time where we will not be saving money because we're not going to lay off staff that have helped out the library, but those staff will have additional capacity to work on other city projects. So do I understand that correctly?
That's correct, Mayor.
Great. So that part of that differential between the 10 and the 16 or so million, the 10 million that we're talking of savings we're talking about reallocating, and the 16 million to run the library. So I understand part of it is we'll have additional capacity to work on other things. So that's good to understand, because of course we're struggling with a lack of capacity across the board. So that'll be really helpful, I think. The other one was, I know back when we were talking about doing an IGA before the ballot measure, this is a number of months ago, we were talking about whether we would be leasing the buildings to the district or transferring ownership of the buildings to the district. And as I recall, we had a majority of us that said, we should lease the buildings to the district. But regardless, does this cost allocation analysis, does it include either the city owning them or the city leasing them, or is that kind of cost neutral? How did that play into this analysis?
Yeah, that's a good question. I can just speak to the portion of looking at the difference between what's available for reallocation versus estimating the total cost of providing the library. The total cost includes us owning the buildings, because that's the total cost to the city today. In terms of anticipating reallocation, it doesn't anticipate the terms of the IGA. So I think we'd have to wait to see exactly what the structure of that was before costing out if there was a difference between the city retaining ownership or not. But I don't think it changes that amount available for reallocation and that we're predicting in 2024, unless there's some other term that the IGA comes up with related to building maintenance that we can't predict at this moment.
Okay, that's helpful to understand. And of course, this body will have to approve any such thing. So if we are assuming we're going in this direction, then we're in good shape. Okay, thanks for answering that. That's all I had.
Aaron, can I colloquy for a second?
Yeah, go for it,
Please.
Mark.
If I recall those conversations, I don't think it had a financial impact one way or the other. We were either going to transfer for nominal consideration, or we were going to lease for nominal consideration. So I'm not sure that the form of the relationship is going to have a great economic impact one way or the other for us.
It's a good point. Thanks, Mark.
Was that all you had, Aaron?
Yes.
All right, Lauren, you're up.
So I just had another clarification around that. It sounds like right now, though, the $10 million in savings does not include any savings in building maintenance, that depending on how the IGA is written is something that we might see. Is that?
Yeah. What I can tell you is that the estimated amount includes an average of the amount of building maintenance that we have done over the last few years. And I think that number was around 500,000. And then we anticipated some direct cash savings above that for those other administrative costs. So it's the library budget as it stands today, plus some building maintenance and some other what we would consider cash savings. Beyond that, like the future anticipated expenses, the major maintenance, those are not built in as cash savings at this moment. And then to your point, the IGA could influence some of that, but we obviously don't know any of that today.
Thank you.
Any other questions about process? Oh, Nicole, I see your hand. Go for it.
Oh, this may be another clarification, not necessarily on process. I just want to make sure that I understood correctly. We're not including in thinking about this reallocation funding available, the 0.33 mils that currently goes toward the library, because what we are expecting based on Teresa's conversations with all of us is that there was a super majority of us that are interested in repealing that property tax should this district measure pass. Did I get that? Did I get that right?
That's correct. The 0.33 mil levy is not reflected in the figures that would be available for reallocation.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. And I just want to extend a big thank you to Teresa for figuring this out. I apologize for not having looked at this closely enough when we were looking at the ballot measures to kind of pull out that detail. So I just thank you, Teresa, for finding a way to reflect what it was we were hoping for.
You are all most welcome. And I think, you know, we all learned a lesson about communication and making sure we have robust conversations around issues that are important. And very happy to try to help lend some clarity to this issue and reflect council's intent and will.
Thanks, Teresa. Mark, you're up.
Just one question for Mark. The $9 to $10 million, using those rough figures, that is not net of the $1.8 million that we're going to lose with the repeal of the 0.333 mill levy, correct?
It is net, so that is excluded from the 9.75 to 10.75. So that 9.75 to 10.75 is what we would expect to have available for reallocation.
Okay, you lost me for a second. The 9 to 10 is after or before deduction of the 1.8 million we'll lose when we repeal the tax?
After.
Okay.
And the tax itself in 2024 is anticipated to be 1.5 million.
Okay, thank you.
Is that all you got, Mark? Okay. Well, outside of any other questions about process, I think we might move to sort of just discussing a little bit about, you know, the areas and the categories that council would like to prioritize with this rough to 10. I know we keep saying 9 to 10. I think for simplicity in math, just call it 10. It's a nice divisible number, but we don't need to split hairs. But we're not going to get into dollars and cents, but just in sort of your thinking, based certainly those are unfunded needs. Just sort of thinking in your head, because saying you want to do an unfunded need that's $20 million and all we're talking about is 10, there's futility in that. But nonetheless, we could take a bite out of it. So anyone want to take a quick crack at where they see some of these priorities and core needs, and does anyone want to go for it? Mark, go for it.
I'm going to start out by being contrarian, because I think this is a conversation without substance. We're effectively formulating our 2024 budget before we've even passed our 2023 budget, and depending upon the timing of the transition, we may be formulating our 2025 budget. As my colleague Bob Yates pointed out in his hotline post, everything we're discussing tonight is both contingent and remote. We have no understanding of what economic conditions will be like, what sales tax revenue is going to be generated, and what other necessities are going to arise. The council voted for a library district, and that was a clear majority, and nothing exceptional about that. And most of my colleagues are strong supporters of the district in their individual capacity, and that's great. But what council is doing tonight is basically producing an infomercial in support of the district and all of the benefits that can arise from the district. And frankly, I think doing so is a little bit beneath us and the role we ought to play as a governing body. Nothing that we're going to discuss tonight has any real grounding in reality. Nothing can be promised, no commitments can be made, and anything we do promise, the community can be undone by a subsequent council other than what we put in the 2024 budget. So to me, all of this is, frankly, and I don't mean to be harsh, but it's a form of performance art. And as I said, this is not an appropriate role for us to be playing. Thank you.
Thanks for your comments, Mark. I might just take an ad here that if we were basing decisions on the uncertainty of budget and what was going on, we would never pass any budget at any point, because we would only pass a budget based on that moment in time. So there has to be planning based on conditions, and this is part of that. I am concerned about sort of a nihilistic perspective that this is sort of showmanship. This is largely a product of having to dispel copious misconceptions that have been spread about this issue, and it's important for us to do that. It is in fact incumbent upon this body to dispel and somewhat be arbiters of truth, so that the community has a fair place from which to judge a lot of these things. And because of those misconceptions, this is one of those where people want to know exactly what this money is and where and how it's going to go. And I think it's important for us to do that. Departments are doing that throughout our city already in preparation for 2024. And we're talking about 2% of our budget with this. So it's important for us to at least be thinking about those buckets intentionally, so that the community has confidence that this money doesn't just get folded into the ether, that there's intent with these savings to meet community needs. And I think that's a fair thing for us to give the community as they evaluate the merits of a library district and what this city is going to do in terms of fulfilling the commitments that it has, both with tax relief, with the 3.33 mills, and what we're trying to do here with the roughly $10 million. So I see Nicole's hand up. Let's turn to Nicole.
Matt, but before you go to Nicole, one comment, please.
Yeah.
Given the well-stated and perfectly appropriate, by the way, views of most of this council on this issue, I am hard-pressed to see us as the arbiters of truth. You are the arbiters of a position, and you're perfectly free to take that position. But as an arbiter of truth, I would expect to have something a little more disinterested in the process. And that's not what is happening here. So
I appreciate that perspective, Mark, but numbers don't lie. So we will work within the facts that have been presented to us. Nicole, please go for it.
Thank you. And thanks everybody for comments so far. And thanks staff for the presentation. I just wanted to say, I think I haven't been shy about the fact that I, support forming a library district at all. And I really feel like voters as part of the decision-making, want to have some insight into what it is we're thinking about here. I think this idea of planning ahead is central to our role as a governing body. I see our primary duties as council members as being protecting our community's safety and protecting our finances, making sure we have enough money to run. So I see this kind of as a financial planning type of exercise. And I think it's an important one for us to be thinking about because, as Matt said, we're not just talking about $1,000 here. This is a fairly large component of our general fund. And, you know, I think there's a lot that we do where we're referring to work that's going to be done by future councils. Just tonight in our discussion of TVAP phase 2, that I think is now Boulder Junction phase 2. There's a different word we were using for it, but we were talking about work that would be done in 2024. That's beyond this council as well. So I think this is part of what we do as we talk about things that are coming in the future. And we certainly can't predict what future councils will do, but we can make the best decisions about what they might do with the information that we have at hand right now. And that's what I see this process as being, not an infomercial, but part of us doing our jobs as council people who are tasked with the governance of our community and thinking well into the future beyond our time on this governing body. With that said, to answer question 2, what I'm looking for is really thinking about more of the new and expanded investments to meet emerging community needs. That is what I would really love to know more about. And when I think about what the function of the libraries are in our community, it's really social infrastructure. It is a free space that has resources that are available to anybody in our community. It is a place for us to come together as communities and connect. There are meeting rooms, spaces we can use. There's art that's displayed throughout the library, resources available, training opportunities, all of these things that build community and connection, which is something that we desperately need as we face the climate crisis and as we move forward as a community. So what I would really love to know more about and to emphasize for consideration of these funds is something that fills a similar purpose, something that's capturing community, social infrastructure, gathering spaces for our community to move forward. It doesn't have to be for the entire community, but different bits and pieces as places we can come together. So I would really love to see this maintain as social infrastructure.
Thank you, Nicole. Junie, then Tara.
Thank you, Matt. I welcome the comments made by Nicole. Thank you for them. And I just wanted to add, for me, just to answer the question, I would say I don't fully understand the new and expanding investment to meet emerging community needs. That's a mouthful in itself. But I think what I want to say is that I hope that we'll use that money in a way that is equitable. For instance, I've had community members who said, in a place like Boulder, where we talk a lot of equity and inclusion, yet we don't really have a cultural center. So maybe that is something we can think about as a community. How do we spend that money to bring forward that equity? Maybe this is where we should use the equity tool and say, what is it we don't have and how we can better use this fund? I saw also tax relief and rebate consideration. There are elderly people in our community, and some people mention how can we use that money to give some of it back to community members in form of tax rebate. That's something, again, when we're talking about equity, that could help us leverage how we use those funds. As far as core operational needs, not so much, because I feel like these needs are always there, but this is an opportunity to maybe, level the playing field, use that money in a way that make people feel like we are bringing the community in together. And I know Nuria has been working really hard since he's been here, since I've been on the council, to ensure that we have that sense of community where we bring more people into the process. And I hope that's what we'll be able to do with this money, to look into some of these issues that we've not been able to implement and put action behind in the form of equity and inclusion. Thank you.
Thank you, Junie. I see Tara, then Aaron.
Well, I just want to stick up for what Mark said, because in some sense, it is like an infomercial, because we're saying, this is what you can have if we pass the library district. So it's a commercial of sorts. But I'm not going to go down that route, because frankly, what I do like is that we have a ballot measure and we can all decide, and that's the fair way. So I'm going to say that I like what Junie said, because what I'm most worried about with the library district by far is the fact that a lot of people who bought homes when they were a couple of $100,000, maybe even like $50,000 back in the day, and now these homes are so expensive, and a lot of people are going to have a hard time with that property tax. So it would make me feel good if we could give relief to those people that can't afford the property tax. So that's the first thing I'd like to see. The second thing is I've always been a big fan of core operational needs, I have to say. And one of the reasons is because when it comes to, taxes, you're paying your taxes and then you're riding your bike and the roads are falling apart and you just broke your tire, your tire just broke or whatever. I feel like core operational needs are what a city is supposed to do. Right now, we have a big backlog of those things. We have a backlog in our roads and maintenance, and in our snow removal could definitely be better. And those are things people really care about. They don't care about them until they just broke their tire, and then all of a sudden they do. So that's important to me. And lastly, I want to talk about parks for a second. Can you hear me?
Yep, we hear you good.
No, I can't even find my Zoom. It's not having a good computer day, so that's good. So parks, remember was it last week when we were talking about stormwater and how they picked a visionary funding? Well, parks is right now under what is called fiscally constrained funding. And that means they have no money. And why that is so important to me, if this does pass, is because parks get so many letters. People are having a hard time affording the cost of the community centers, and they're having there's not enough maintenance, there's not enough pool time. There are so many things people want to see in parks, and they are under a lot of stress right now. Parks does a great job when it comes to equity. They offer so many discounts for people that are marginalized or in need. And so it is super important that we fund our parks to better levels than fiscally constrained. I think we should get it up to at least we're doing a pretty good job funding, whatever that is. But right now, we get so many letters, it's such a low. So that's why I would like to see more of our money, if we did have that, and if this did pass, going to parks. That's it.
Thank you, Tara. Aaron, you're up.
Great, thanks, Matt. Well, just to start about why we're having this conversation, I think it's specifically in response to community requests that I've heard from many community members about, hey, what will the money get spent on if these funds are freed up? And so I think this is being responsive to some desires in the community rather than for infomercial purposes. That's certainly not my intention. So to that point, I'll just offer a few thoughts that, and just note that the amounts that we're talking here, about $10 million a year, is about what we've gotten from ARPA funding for 2 years, is about $10 million a year. So and which we're able to do some really helpful things for our community with that money, right? So this provides a similar opportunity, but out into perpetuity. So I thought what Nicole said about social infrastructure was really good. I think that we need more of that in our community, in our society. So it's a great point. I liked what Junie said about, certainly applying an equity lens, and I think going out and talking to people in the community that are missing some of those, gathering opportunities or service opportunities, and finding out what they need, right? So I think that's not predetermining every dollar for sure, but thinking about who we're talking to as we're developing a spending program. And then I also noticed like the behavioral health response, emergency response program that we're standing up this next year, that's being done with one-time funding. So if that goes as well as I'm expecting and hoping that it does, we're going to need ongoing funding for that, and that would be a real opportunity here. Something else that I've had my eye on throughout almost my entire time on council is, we're moving towards bringing advanced life support services in-house in the fire department. And that's about paying EMTs better and providing better service to our community and making our emergency response and our firefighters kind of more effective, and also giving them a better working environment. So I would definitely prioritize that for some of this funding, because every single person in the community, if something if they're in crisis, like a medical crisis, having that response come faster and higher quality is a benefit to each and every member of our community. And then the last thing I'll just say is that the tax increase would be a relatively modest one at about 4% of property taxes. It is going to fall harder on some people than on others, and so I think developing some kind of a rebate program, not across the board, but with criteria, income-based or hardship-based criteria for individuals and small businesses, I think would be beneficial. And I don't know, I'm not going to try to pretend what percentage of funding should go to what right now, but those are some core areas that I would look at for funding priorities. And thanks for the opportunity to talk about it.
Thanks, Aaron. I appreciate that. Some thoughtful comments there. I just saw Rachel drop. Did you intend to go?
I believe I intended to unmute myself and I instead hit the hand button. They're not even close to each other, so I think there's no good excuse.
All good, because I think I saw your hand up in front of Lauren, so I wanted to just honor that. So go for it, Rachel, and then I see Lauren.
Thanks for honoring my faux hand. So this is a little bit tricky for me. I laughed at Mark's use of the word infomercial. It hit my funny bone. Thank you for that. And I don't want this to feel like an infomercial of just like what my sort of pet projects or desires are for funding. And so I'm a little bit loath to weigh in on like what are my favorite uses of 10 million bonus dollars. So I think what I feel is that it's probably going to be best for Nuria to say, here's where we have the highest need for $10 million given council priorities as they stand in November of 2022 and going forward. So I'm not going to be able to weigh in much deeper than that, because we have a over $500 million budget, and this is in some senses a drop in the bucket, and I feel like staff is going to be better able to tell us whether we need it for EMS versus flood mitigation versus homelessness services or anything else that we're looking at. So I don't feel I can weigh in too well on this. Thanks.
Thank you, Rachel. Lauren, you're up.
Thank you. One of the comments Mark brought up is about this being performative. And I just wanted to, it got me thinking, because sure, you could make that argument, but you can also make that argument about a lot of things that go on. I mean, to a certain extent, being an elected official, being on Channel 8, there is a performative nature to all of this that we do. And I get the criticism, but I don't think that this is, that's just part of our job. So with that being said, I, like Nicole, really strongly would support this a sizable allocation of these funds being spent on social infrastructure projects like parks. I think that, but there could be other options there. And then sort of my second tier would be life safety things like Aaron brought up, the advanced life safety support and also Vision Zero things. I think that, you know, those are making sure that people in our community are safe is really, there's few things more important that we do. I did want to bring up this rebates. I have an issue with using general fund dollars, which are largely sales tax based, which are a regressive tax, to give property tax credits, which would mostly go towards people who own property within our community. I think that there's an inherent equity issue there. There might be ways to overcome that with really smart high-end targeting of who those funds go to, but I'm going to be fairly skeptical. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. Barring anyone else's hand up, I'll weigh in a little. For one, I appreciate the thoughtfulness from the comments that have come before. You know, certainly I see social infrastructure as an absolute need. I think that's a high priority in our community. It's an increasing need in our community. So, you know, ARPA is finite in nature, and we've been largely using a finite source of money to prop up our increasing needs of social infrastructure. So the fact that we could supplement what was finite in terms of ARPA with money that can sort of hang out in perpetuity, I think is a generational opportunity given the social infrastructure needs that are presented in front of our community right now and will continue to be the case. So I appreciate Nicole's comments on that and those that have backed that up. I think that's spot on. You know, the other interesting part is I do appreciate where Aaron was going with ALS, advanced life support. I think that's a huge thing with regards to community safety, right? I mean, the first things we take our pledge to as council members is health and safety of our community. So hard to ignore that as an important investment. You know, I think, you know, the rebate conversation is tricky. I tend to align with where Lauren is. I think that's tricky to take sales tax and give a property tax rebate. But I do think in terms of, you know, groups that are hit hard by the library district's funding is the business community. And so I'd like to see us think about some small business tax grants and small business support because, you know, it still isn't easy for them and they're still recovering. And so I think if we can certainly give them a leg up and give them some support to soften the landing a little bit, I think that would go a long way and be quite important for us to do. I didn't really see where that fit into sort of those main categories. And since that is gone, I'll just remind in case people didn't see it, Mark was kind enough to put those questions in the chat. So if you want to refer back to those core areas, they're sitting in the chat. You know, and the other part is certainly, you know, some of our climate work. I know we've got a climate tax, but in some ways there isn't enough money to deal with the immense impacts of climate change. And so certainly thinking how to help climate initiatives out, whether it be e-bike program or wildfire resiliency. So those are some of the things that for me seem, and they aren't just pet projects. These are things that have been overwhelmingly shouted at us by the community. And so in many ways, we're just reflecting the community needs back to this $10 million to try to find ways to make sure we meet those needs sooner rather than later. So those are my thoughts on it. Does anyone else have anything else before we move on? I don't see any hands. So let me ask Mark and Kara, you know, based on sort of what you've been hearing, do you feel like you've heard some consolidated thoughts that inform you in terms of where the thoughts are on this roughly $10 million and what departments you know you are worth reaching out to in terms of how to think about allocating this money should it be freed up after the November election?
Yes, I think so. We certainly have a couple specifics that we'll do some sharpening of our pencil on and try to bring back some more specific numbers. And then again, we'll be working closely with FSC on what that prioritization process looks like and target coming back for a more robust conversation in the winter if the district passes.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Kara. I really appreciate it. And thank you, Teresa, for helping us navigate the 0.33 mil and providing just real clarity about what 2C is, and then also the commitment that staff and council will make in terms of the emergency ordinance right immediately on the heels of the election results in that sort of, I think, November 13th meeting, I think is the one that I think I said, or something like that. But anyway, one of those. But anyway, thank you so much.
Yes, following the election, and
yes.
and absolutely our pleasure, and we appreciate you all sticking with us as we reasoned through this.
Well, thanks again. And as always, navigating all that is Nuria. I know she's been quiet tonight, but thanks to Nuria for helping navigate all of those pieces in this conversation. So thank you for that.
Our pleasure.
All right. Well, we're at 8:35. Anything else on the table? Don't think so. It's not a regular meeting, so we don't have matters. Going once, going twice. All right. Well, yep. And I saw the gesture for sold from Rachel. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and adjourn this meeting at 8:35. I think we beat our time frame, so kudos to everyone. And anyways, thank you all so much. Have a great week. And then also, yeah, we're not meeting next week, so we have sort of a week off in terms of meetings. And then we'll be back in person all the way around October 6th. Council, staff, and the community look forward to seeing everybody in 2 weeks in person. So have fun, enjoy. Have a good
Good
night.
job, Matt.
Yeah, nicely done, Matt. Good night, everybody.
Night.